The thunder rolling across the high desert plains was not from the sky, and Silas Anderson knew death was coming before he even saw the wall of wild longhorns crashing through the mesquite and sage like a force of pure destruction. The ground beneath his horse trembled, and when his eyes tracked the path of the stampede, he saw her standing frozen in the middle of the canyon pass. A woman in a pale blue dress who had just become the unluckiest person in West Texas on this scorching afternoon in August of 1878. Every instinct screamed at Silas to wheel his buckskin mare around and get to higher ground, but his body moved before his mind could catch up. He dug his heels into the horse's flanks and charged straight toward the stampede, toward the woman who had not yet realized that several hundred head of panicked cattle were bearing down on her position, with enough force to crush bones into dust and turn flesh into nothing but a memory on the desert floor. The roar of hooves grew louder, drowning out everything except the hammering of his own heart and the sound of his mare's labored breathing as they raced against impossible odds. The woman finally turned, her face draining of color when she saw what was coming. She tried to run, but her skirts tangled around her legs and she stumbled, going down hard on the rocky ground. Silas was still 50 yards away when the front edge of the stampede entered the canyon pass, and he knew with cold certainty that he had perhaps 10 seconds to reach her or watch her die. He leaned low over his horse's neck, urging every ounce of speed from the animal. The buckskin responded with a burst of power that Silas had not known she possessed, eating up the ground between them and the fallen woman. 20 yards, 15. The cattle were so close now that Silas could see the foam flying from their mouths and the wild terror in their rolling eyes. He pulled his right foot from the stirrup and prepared to do something that was either incredibly brave or monumentally stupid. When he reached the woman, Silas did not slow down. He could not afford to. Instead, he leaned far out of the saddle, grabbed her around the waist with his right arm, and hauled her up off the ground in one fluid motion that sent pain screaming through his shoulder. She cried out in surprise and fear, but he had no time to reassure her. He could feel the heat from the cattle's bodies, could smell the rank odor of their sweat and terror. He pulled the woman across his lap, turned the mare hard to the right, and drove toward the canyon wall where a narrow gap in the rocks offered the only chance of survival. The mare understood what was needed. She found speed that should not have existed and carried them toward that gap as the stampede roared past so close that Silas felt the brush of coarse hide against his leg. They crashed into the narrow opening between two massive boulders, and Silas pulled the horse up short, spinning her around so they would not hit the rock face head on. The woman in his arms was shaking violently, her hands gripping his shirt with desperate strength. The stampede thundered past their hiding place in a river of muscle and horn and mindless panic. The sound was overwhelming, a physical force that seemed to press against Silas's chest and make his ears ring. Dust filled the air so thickly that he could barely see, could barely breathe. He pulled his bandana up over his nose and mouth, then tore the woman's shawl from her shoulders and pressed it over her face to help her filter the air. She was still trembling, but she held the fabric in place and pressed herself against his chest as if she could disappear into him and escape the chaos raging just a few feet away. The stampede seemed to go on forever. Time lost all meaning as hundreds of cattle poured through the canyon, past in a mass exodus from whatever had spooked them in the first place. Silas kept one arm wrapped firmly around the woman and the other hand on his mare's reins, speaking softly to the horse to keep her calm. The buckskin was veteran enough not to panic, but her eyes showed white and her muscles quivered with the effort of standing still, while every instinct told her to run. When the last of the cattle finally passed and the sound began to fade into the distance, Silas became aware of other things. The woman in his arms smelled like lavender and soap, despite the dust that now coated them both. Her hair had come loose from its pins and fell in dark waves around her shoulders. She was pressed so tightly against him that he could feel the rapid beating of her heart, and she was crying, though she made no sound, her whole body shaking with silent sobs of relief and residual terror. "You are safe now," Silas said, his voice rough from dust and adrenaline. "They have passed." The woman lifted her head, and for the first time, Silas got a clear look at her face. She was perhaps 22 or 23 years old, with dark eyes that seemed too large in her pale face, and features that would have been quite lovely if they had not been streaked with dust and tears. She stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to understand that she was actually still alive. "You saved my life," she whispered. You rode straight into that stampede to save me. Could not exactly leave you there to get trampled, Silas replied. He was suddenly very aware of how intimately she was positioned in his lap, and he felt heat rise to his face that had nothing to do with the August sun. Can you stand? I should probably set you down now. I think so. But when Silas carefully lowered her to the ground, her legs buckled and she would have fallen if he had not dismounted quickly and caught her. I am sorry. I seem to be made of water at the moment. That is shock, Silas said. It is normal after something like that. Just lean on me until your legs remember how to work. He kept his arm around her waist, supporting her weight easily. She was smaller than he had realized, the top of her head barely reaching his chin. What were you doing out here alone anyway? This is not exactly safe country for a woman by herself. I was not supposed to be alone. The woman's voice was steadier now, though she still leaned heavily against him. I came out from El Paso with my father and 2 of his ranch hands. We were surveying the north section of our land. I wandered off to look at some wildflowers growing near those rocks over there, and when I heard them calling, I started back. But then the stampede came, and I could not see where they had gone, and I just froze like the world's greatest fool. You did not cause the stampede, Silas pointed out, and freezing is what most people would do. At least you did not try to outrun cattle, which never works. He looked around, taking in their surroundings with a more critical eye now that the immediate danger had passed. We should get you back to your father. He is probably worried sick. He is probably furious, the woman corrected, but there was a hint of humor in her voice now. He has told me 1,000 times not to wander off. I suppose nearly being killed will prove his point rather effectively. She took a tentative step away from Silas, testing her legs. They held her weight this time, though she still looked shaky. I am Georgina Palmer, by the way. My father owns the Palmer Ranch about 5 miles east of El Paso. Silas Anderson. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of courtesy. I have a small spread about 10 miles north of town. Came down here tracking some strays that broke through my fence last week. He glanced in the direction the stampede had gone. Guess I found them, along with about 500 of someone else's cattle. Those would be our cattle, Georgina said with a sigh. Or they were. My father is going to lose his mind when he finds out they stampeded. We were supposed to be moving them to better grazing land tomorrow, nice and controlled. Something must have spooked them at the holding pen. Mountain lion, most likely, Silas said. I saw tracks near the creek this morning, big male from the size of them. He walked over to his mare and stroked her neck, praising her for her courage and speed. The horse nickered softly and bumped her nose against his chest, clearly ready to be done with excitement for the day. Come on, my horse can carry us both back toward where you left your father. With any luck, we will meet him coming to look for you. Georgina hesitated, and Silas realized she was probably trying to decide whether getting on a horse with a strange man was more or less dangerous than staying out in the desert alone. He could not entirely blame her for the calculation. They had just met after all, even if the meeting had involved him saving her life. Women had to be cautious in this country, and a smart woman did not simply trust a man just because he happened to be nearby when she needed help. You can ride and I will walk if that makes you more comfortable, Silas offered. But we should get moving. The sun will be setting in a few hours, and you do not want to be out here after dark. Something in his face must have reassured her, because Georgina nodded and stepped closer. We can both ride. You risked your life for me. The least I can do is trust you to get me home safely. She paused, then added quietly, Thank you, Silas. I truly mean that. You are the bravest man I have ever met. Silas felt that heat rise to his face again, and he busied himself with checking his saddle so she would not see him flush like a schoolboy. He was 31 years old, too old to be acting like a nervous kid just because a pretty woman had said something kind to him. But it had been a long time since anyone had called him brave, and coming from Georgina, the word seemed to carry more weight than it should. He mounted first, then reached down to help Georgina up. She settled behind him on the horse, wrapping her arms around his waist to steady herself. The intimacy of the position was not lost on either of them, and for a moment they both sat very still, hyper-aware of the contact. Then Silas urged the mare forward, and they left the narrow gap in the rocks behind, emerging back into the main canyon pass. The destruction left by the stampede was impressive. The ground was churned into powder by hundreds of hooves, and in several places, the cattle had knocked over small bushes and even a young tree. Silas guided his horse carefully around the worst of the debris, heading east toward where Georgina said she had last seen her father. "How long have you had your ranch?" Georgina asked after they had ridden in silence for several minutes. Her voice was close to his ear, and Silas found it disconcertingly pleasant. 3 years, he replied. "Bought it from a man who wanted to go back east after his wife died. It is not much, just a small operation, but it is mine." He heard the pride in his own voice and felt slightly embarrassed by it, but Georgina made a soft sound of understanding. "That matters," she said. "Owning your own land, being your own boss. My father feels the same way about our ranch. He built it from nothing over 20 years, and he would rather die than give it up." She paused, then added, "I grew up on that ranch. I cannot imagine living anywhere else." "You are lucky," Silas said. "Not everyone knows where they belong. Do you? Know where you belong, I mean." Silas considered the question as they rode. "I think so. I spent a lot of years drifting, working as a hired hand, moving from place to place. But when I saw the land that became my ranch, something settled inside me, like I had finally found the spot where I was supposed to put down roots." He shook his head slightly, feeling foolish. "That probably sounds strange." "It does not sound strange at all," Georgina said softly. "It sounds like home." They continued eastward, and after another mile, they spotted 3 riders coming toward them at a gallop. Georgina stiffened behind Silas, and he heard her take a deep breath, as if preparing for battle. "That is my father," she said. "The big man on the gray horse. The other 2 are Miguel and Tom, our ranch hands." The 3 men pulled up hard when they reached Silas and Georgina, and the big man on the gray horse immediately began barking questions. He was in his early 50s, Silas guessed, with iron gray hair and a weathered face that showed he had spent most of his life under the harsh Texas sun. His eyes, the same dark shade as Georgina's, were wild with worry and anger. "Georgina, where in the blazes have you been? We have been searching for over an hour. When that stampede came through, I thought you were dead for certain." He pulled his horse closer, his eyes raking over his daughter as if checking for injuries. Then his gaze shifted to Silas, and suspicion replaced relief in an instant. "Who are you, and why is my daughter on your horse?" "This is Silas Anderson, father," Georgina said quickly. "He saved my life. I was in the path of the stampede, and he rode through it to pull me clear. If not for him, you would be burying me tonight instead of yelling at me." The anger drained from the older man's face, replaced by something that looked like shock and residual fear. "In the path of the stampede?" he repeated, his voice suddenly hoarse. "Oh, Georgie. Oh, my girl." He seemed at a loss for words, and one of his hands reached out toward her, as if to reassure himself that she was real and whole. "I am fine, father. Shaken, but fine." Georgina slipped down from Silas's horse and went to her father, who dismounted quickly and pulled her into a fierce embrace. "I am so sorry I worried you. I know I should not have wandered off." "No, you should not have," her father said roughly, but there was no real anger in his voice now, only relief. "But that does not matter. What matters is that you are safe." He released her and turned to Silas, who had also dismounted. "Mr. Anderson, is it? I am George Palmer, and I owe you a debt I can never repay. You saved my daughter's life, and there are no words sufficient for that." "No debt necessary," Silas said, feeling uncomfortable with the level of gratitude in the other man's eyes. "I did what anyone would have done." "No," George Palmer said firmly. "You did what a brave and decent man would do. Most people would have saved themselves and left her to her fate. Do not diminish what you did." He extended his hand, and Silas shook it, feeling the strength in the older man's grip. "You must come back to the ranch with us. Stay for dinner at the very least. I insist." Silas started to decline, but Georgina spoke up before he could. "Please, Silas, it would mean a great deal to me. I would like the chance to properly thank you for what you did." There was something in her eyes, a warmth and sincerity that made it impossible for Silas to refuse. He found himself nodding before he had fully decided to accept. "I would be honored, thank you." The ride back to the Palmer Ranch took about 40 minutes, and during that time, Silas learned that George Palmer was indeed the owner of a substantial cattle operation. He ran nearly 2,000 head on land that stretched across several sections, and he employed a dozen men year-round, more during roundup and drives. He had come to Texas from Missouri in 1858, bringing with him his young wife and a determination to build something lasting in this harsh but beautiful country. "Lost my wife 5 years ago to fever," George said as they rode. "Georgina has been running the household ever since. Does a better job than I ever could, truth be told. She has a head for numbers and organization that I certainly lack." "Father, please," Georgina said, sounding embarrassed. She had been given one of the ranch hands' horses to ride, and she sat the saddle with the easy grace of someone who had been riding since childhood. "Mr. Anderson does not need to hear about my bookkeeping skills." "Why not? It is something to be proud of," George said. "Too many men think women cannot handle such things, but they are wrong. My Georgina could run this whole ranch if she had to." Silas found himself impressed by that, though he tried not to show it too obviously. He had known plenty of women who were as capable as any man when it came to ranch work, but not all fathers recognized or valued those abilities in their daughters. George Palmer clearly did, and it spoke well of his character. The Palmer Ranch, when they finally reached it, was far more impressive than Silas had expected. The main house was a sprawling adobe structure with a wide covered porch and actual glass in the windows, a luxury in this part of Texas. Behind it stood a large barn, several corrals, a bunkhouse for the ranch hands, and various other outbuildings. Everything looked well-maintained and prosperous, the sign of a successful operation. "You have built something remarkable here," Silas said honestly as they dismounted in front of the main house. 20 years of blood, sweat, and stubbornness," George replied, but there was satisfaction in his voice. "Now come inside. Georgina will get you cleaned up, and we will have dinner. I want to hear exactly how you managed to pull my daughter out of a stampede and live to tell about it." Inside, the house was even more impressive. The main room was large and comfortable, furnished with well-made furniture and decorated with the kind of touches that suggested a woman's hand. Georgina excused herself to change out of her dust-covered dress, and one of the ranch hands, a young Mexican man named Miguel, showed Silas to a washroom where he could clean up. When Silas looked in the mirror, he was startled by his own appearance. His face was caked with dust, his dark hair was standing up in all directions, and his blue eyes looked almost startling against the dirt. He washed quickly and thoroughly, then tried to make his hair behave with limited success. When he emerged, he found George waiting with 2 glasses of whiskey. "You look like you could use this," George said, handing one to Silas. "I know I certainly can." They sat on the porch as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Silas sipped his whiskey and told the full story of the rescue, leaving out no details. George listened intently, his face growing paler as he realized how close his daughter had come to death. 10 seconds, George said when Silas had finished. "You said you had maybe 10 seconds to reach her." "If that," Silas confirmed. "It was the closest call I have ever seen, and I have seen some close ones." George drained his whiskey in one long swallow. "I need to do something for you, Anderson. Money, land, cattle, whatever you need. Name it." "I do not need anything," Silas said, and he meant it. "Your daughter is alive. That is enough." "It is not enough for me," George said firmly. "Let me think on it. I will come up with something appropriate." He refilled both their glasses, then raised his in a toast. "To brave men and fast horses." "To fast horses," Silas agreed, clinking his glass against George's. "The brave men just try not to fall off." George laughed at that, a genuine belly laugh that seemed to release some of the tension he had been holding. They were still sitting on the porch when Georgina emerged from the house wearing a clean dress of deep green that brought out the richness of her dark hair. She had washed away all the dust and pinned her hair up in a style that was both practical and attractive. Silas found himself staring and forced his eyes away before she noticed. "Dinner is ready," Georgina announced. "I hope you like beef, Mr. Anderson, because that is mostly what we have around here." "Call me Silas, please," he said, standing. "And I like beef just fine." Dinner was a substantial meal of steak, beans, cornbread, and vegetables, from what Georgina explained was her kitchen garden. They ate at a large wooden table in a dining room that suggested George Palmer took his role as a successful rancher seriously. The food was excellent, and Silas said so repeatedly, earning pleased smiles from Georgina. "My mother taught me to cook," she said. "She believed that running a household properly was as important as running a ranch. I miss her every day, but I try to honor her memory by maintaining the standards she set." "You do her proud," George said gruffly. "She would be very pleased to see the woman you have become, Georgie." The conversation flowed easily throughout the meal, and Silas found himself relaxing in a way he had not expected. George was a good storyteller, with decades of ranching experiences to draw from. And Georgina proved to be quick-witted and intelligent, with opinions on everything from cattle breeding to territorial politics. Silas contributed his own stories when appropriate, and he was surprised to find himself laughing more than he had in months. When the meal was finished, Georgina shooed both men back to the porch while she cleaned up. Silas offered to help, but she refused, saying that a guest who had saved her life was certainly not going to wash dishes in her house. George led Silas back outside, and they settled into comfortable chairs to watch the last of the sunset fade into night. "I meant what I said about doing something for you," George said after a while, "and I have been thinking about what that might be." "Really, it is not necessary," Silas began, but George held up a hand. "Hear me out. You said you have a small spread about 10 miles north of town. How many head are you running?" "About 50, Silas admitted. "I am trying to build it up slowly, but good breeding stock is expensive, and I am doing most of the work myself. It is slow going." "What if I sold you 20 of my best heifers at half their market value?" George proposed. "Young stock, already bred to a good bull. That would give your herd a significant boost, and the calves they drop next spring would be worth good money." Silas felt his jaw drop. "Mr. Palmer, I cannot accept that. Do you know what 20 bred heifers are worth? Even at half price, that is an extraordinary gift." "It is not a gift. You would still be paying for them," George pointed out. "Just not as much as you would pay someone else. And frankly, Anderson, it is not even close to the value I place on my daughter's life. So, you will accept or you will insult me deeply." Silas struggled with the offer. His pride wanted to refuse, to insist he could build his ranch on his own without help. But his practical side knew that an opportunity like this might never come again. 20 good heifers could mean the difference between barely scraping by and actually thriving. And George Palmer had framed it in a way that allowed Silas to keep his dignity. "I accept," Silas said finally, "and I thank you. This will make a real difference for my operation." "Good." George looked satisfied. "You can come by next week to pick them out. Bring a few hands if you have them, or I will lend you some of mine to help drive them back to your place." He paused, then added, "I also want to extend an open invitation. You are welcome at this ranch any time, Anderson. For meals, for advice, for whatever you might need. Consider us friends as well as neighbors." "I would like that," Silas said, and he realized he meant it deeply. He had been lonely on his ranch. He could admit that now. Having neighbors he could call friends would mean more than he had realized he needed. Georgina returned to the porch carrying a tray with coffee and a plate of dried apple pie. "I thought you might want something sweet," she said, setting the tray down on a small table between the chairs. "The apples are from our own trees. We have a small orchard on the east side of the property." "You have trees that grow in this climate?" Silas asked, impressed. "We have a spring that feeds into a creek," Georgina explained. "It provides enough water for an orchard if you are careful about it. We have apples, peaches, and even a few pear trees. It was my mother's project originally, but I have maintained it since she passed." They talked for another hour, drinking coffee and eating pie while the stars came out overhead in their thousands. Silas found himself telling them about his life before he bought his ranch, about the years he had spent drifting from job to job, never quite finding a place where he fit. Georgina listened with obvious interest, asking questions that showed she was genuinely curious rather than just being polite. "Why did you finally decide to settle down?" she asked at one point. "What made you choose this particular area?" Silas thought about it, trying to put into words something he had never fully articulated even to himself. "I think I was tired of not belonging anywhere, tired of always being the hired hand, the outsider, the one who would be moving on in a few months. I wanted to build something that would last, something I could be proud of. And when I found this land, something just felt right about it, like maybe I had been looking for it all along without knowing it. That is exactly how my father described it when we first came here," Georgina said softly. "He said it felt like coming home, even though he had never been to Texas before." "That is it exactly," Silas agreed. "It felt like coming home." Eventually, George announced that he was heading to bed, and Silas realized with a start that it was quite late. He stood, intending to take his leave, but Georgina spoke up quickly. "You should stay the night," she said. "It is too dark to ride safely back to your ranch, and we have plenty of room. There is a guest room that is already made up." Silas hesitated, but George added his voice to his daughter's invitation. She is right. No sense risking your neck riding in the dark after the day you have had. Stay, get a good night's sleep, and head out in the morning. I will have Miguel pack you some food for the ride. It was a sensible suggestion, and Silas was more tired than he wanted to admit. If you are sure I am not imposing. You saved my daughter's life, George said flatly. You could impose for the next 20 years and not begin to balance that scale. Now come on, I will show you to your room. The guest room was small but comfortable, with a real bed and clean sheets. Silas lay awake for a long time after George left, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the strange turn his day had taken. This morning, he had been tracking strays, alone and focused on his own small problems. Now, he was lying in a guest room at a prosperous ranch, having made friends with the owner and his daughter, with a deal for 20 bred heifers that would transform his operation. And then there was Georgina herself. Silas could not seem to stop thinking about her. The way she had felt in his arms during the rescue, light and soft, but stronger than she looked. The way her eyes lit up when she smiled, the way she listened when he talked, as if what he had to say actually mattered. He told himself not to be a fool. She was the daughter of a wealthy rancher, beautiful and educated and capable. He was a small-time operator trying to scrape together a living on land that fought him every day. She was out of his league in every possible way. But the heart did not always listen to logic, and as Silas finally drifted off to sleep, he could not help but hope that he would have a reason to return to the Palmer Ranch soon. He woke early the next morning, a habit ingrained by years of ranch work. When he emerged from his room, he found Georgina already up and preparing breakfast in the kitchen. She smiled when she saw him, a genuine expression of pleasure that made his heart beat a little faster. I hoped you would be an early riser, she said. Father will sleep for another hour at least, but I thought you might want to get back to your ranch at a decent time. I have coffee ready, and breakfast will be done shortly. You did not have to do all this, Silas said, but he accepted the cup of coffee she handed him gratefully. It was strong and hot, exactly what he needed. I wanted to, Georgina said simply. She returned to the stove where she was frying eggs and bacon. Besides, it gives me a chance to talk to you without Father listening to every word. Silas felt his eyebrows rise. Is there something you want to say to me in private? Georgina was quiet for a moment, her attention apparently focused on the eggs. Then she turned to face him, and he saw something vulnerable in her expression that had not been there before. I wanted to really thank you, without my father turning it into some kind of business transaction or male bonding moment. You risked your life for me yesterday, Silas. You did not know me. You had no reason to do what you did except that you are a good man who could not stand by and watch someone die. That means more to me than I can properly express. Anyone would have done the same, Silas said, but his voice was softer than he intended. No, they would not have, Georgina said firmly. Most people would have saved themselves. You chose differently, and I am alive because of it. So, thank you, Silas Anderson. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. She was standing very close to him now, and Silas was acutely aware of her presence. He wanted to say something profound, something that would match the moment, but all he managed was, You are welcome, Georgina. I am just glad I was there when you needed help. They looked at each other for a long moment, and something passed between them, a connection, a recognition of something that might have potential if they were brave enough to pursue it. Then Georgina smiled and turned back to her cooking, and the moment passed, but it did not disappear. It lingered in the air between them like a promise. Breakfast was excellent, and George joined them about halfway through the meal, looking well-rested and in good spirits. He insisted that Silas take a sack of food for his ride home, and he walked Silas out to where Miguel had already saddled the buckskin mare and tied the food sack to the saddle horn. Remember, you come by next week to pick out those heifers, George said, shaking Silas's hand firmly. And do not be a stranger after that. We are neighbors now, and neighbors look out for each other. I will remember, Silas promised. He mounted his horse and looked back at the house, where Georgina stood on the porch watching. He touched his hat to her, and she raised one hand in farewell, her expression warm and perhaps a little wistful. The ride back to his own ranch gave Silas plenty of time to think. His small spread looked even smaller after seeing the Palmer operation, but it was still his, and that mattered. He spent the rest of the day catching up on chores he had neglected during his search for his strays, and trying not to think about Georgina Palmer. He failed spectacularly at the latter. The following week, Silas rode back to the Palmer ranch to select his heifers. George was waiting for him, along with 2 of his ranch hands, and they spent the morning going through George's cattle, picking out 20 of the best young females. They were fine animals, exactly the kind of breeding stock Silas needed to improve his herd. George had not been exaggerating about the quality or the generosity of his offer. Georgina appeared around mid-morning, carrying a basket of lunch, and the men took a break to eat. She sat with them on the corral fence, asking intelligent questions about the cattle and making observations that showed she knew as much about ranching as any of the men present. Silas found himself increasingly drawn to her, and he thought he saw interest in her eyes when she looked at him, though he could not be certain. After lunch, George helped Silas and his borrowed hands drive the 20 heifers back to Silas's ranch. George made approving noises about Silas's setup, offering suggestions for improvements that were tactful rather than critical. By the time they had the heifers settled in Silas's best pasture and George was mounting up to leave, Silas felt like he had gained not just valuable livestock but a mentor and friend. "You have done well here," George said, looking around at the ranch with a critical but kind eye. "Another few years and you will have a real operation going. These heifers will help considerably." "I cannot thank you enough," Silas said honestly. "This changes everything for me." "Then we are even," George said, "or at least closer to it. Now, I expect to see you at our place for dinner on Sunday. Georgina is planning a big meal, and she specifically asked me to invite you." Silas felt his heart leap at that information, but tried to keep his expression neutral. "I would be honored to accept." "Good." George's eyes were sharp and knowing, and Silas suspected the older man understood exactly what was beginning to develop between Silas and his daughter. "See you Sunday then. And Anderson, my daughter is the most precious thing in my life. Keep that in mind." It was both a warning and a blessing, and Silas understood both parts. "I will. Sir, you have my word." Sunday found Silas nervously approaching the Palmer ranch on his freshly groomed horse, wearing his best shirt and pants. He had even trimmed his hair and shaved carefully, wanting to make a good impression. When Georgina opened the door to his knock, her face lit up with a smile that made all his preparation worthwhile. "Silas, I am so glad you could come. Please, come in." The dinner was indeed a substantial affair, with roasted chicken, vegetables, fresh bread, and a dried fruit pie for dessert. George regaled them with stories from his early days in Texas, and Georgina added her own memories of growing up on the ranch. Silas contributed what he could, but mostly he was content to listen and watch Georgina, noting the way her eyes crinkled when she laughed and the graceful movements of her hands as she talked. After dinner, George excused himself to check on something in the barn, leaving Silas and Georgina alone on the porch, in what was almost certainly a deliberate maneuver. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun set in its nightly display of color. "I am glad you came today," Georgina said eventually. "I have been thinking about you this week." Silas felt his pulse quicken. "I have been thinking about you too," he admitted, "more than I probably should." "Why should you not think about me?" Georgina asked, turning to look at him directly. "Because you are you, and I am me," Silas said, struggling to articulate what he meant. "You are the daughter of a successful rancher, beautiful and accomplished. I am just a man trying to build something from nothing. We are not exactly in the same position in life. Does that matter?" Georgina's voice was soft but intense. "You are one of the bravest, most decent men I have ever met, Silas. You risked your life for a stranger without hesitation. You work hard, you are honest, and you treat people with respect. Those are the things that matter to me, not how many head of cattle someone runs or how big their ranch is." "Your father might feel differently," Silas pointed out. "My father likes you," Georgina said firmly. "He has told me so repeatedly, and he trusts my judgment. If I choose to care about someone, he will support that choice as long as the man in question is honorable, which you are." Silas looked at her, his heart pounding. "Are you saying you care about me, Georgina?" "I am saying I think I could," she replied, her cheeks flushing slightly. "If you were interested in pursuing that possibility, I know we barely know each other, but something about you feels right, Silas. Like maybe you were supposed to be in that canyon pass at exactly the right moment for more reasons than just saving my life." It was the opening Silas had not dared to hope for, and he was not fool enough to let it pass. "I would like to pursue that possibility very much," he said, "if you are sure and if your father does not mind." "I am sure," Georgina said, and the smile on her face was radiant. "And my father already gave me his blessing. Why do you think he left us alone?" Silas laughed at that, feeling some of his nervousness dissolve. "He is not subtle, is he?" "Not even slightly," Georgina agreed. "But he means well. He wants me to be happy, and he thinks you might be able to make that happen. For what it is worth, I think he might be right." They talked for hours that evening, long after George had finished his business in the barn and discreetly retired to his room. They talked about their hopes and dreams, their fears and failures, the things that mattered to them, and the things they wanted to build in their lives. By the time Silas finally rode home under a sky full of stars, he knew with certainty that Georgina Palmer was the woman he wanted to spend his life with. The only question was how to make that happen when he still had so little to offer her. Over the following months, Silas became a regular visitor at the Palmer Ranch. He came for dinners and workdays, helping with roundups and fence mending, and 100 other tasks that were always needed on a large operation. George seemed pleased by his presence and often sought his opinion on ranch matters, treating him more like a partner than a visitor. And Georgina was always there, smiling when he arrived, talking with him for hours, walking with him in the orchard or along the creek. Their relationship deepened gradually, naturally, like water finding its course through stone. They held hands during evening walks. They sat close together on the porch. And one evening in October, when the air had finally begun to cool from the summer's brutal heat, Silas kissed her for the first time under the stars, and Georgina kissed him back with a passion that left them both breathless. "I love you," Silas said when they finally broke apart. "I think I have loved you since the moment I pulled you out of that stampede." "I love you too," Georgina whispered, "and I think I have been waiting my whole life for you to ride into it." Silas knew he should wait to propose. He should build up his ranch more, prove that he could provide for her properly. But he also knew that Georgina was not a woman who needed to be provided for in the traditional sense. She was capable and strong, and what she wanted was a partner, not a provider. So, on a crisp November evening, with George's blessing obtained earlier that day, Silas asked Georgina Palmer to marry him. She said yes without hesitation, and Silas felt his world transform in that instant. Everything he had been working toward, everything he had hoped to build, suddenly had a focus and a purpose beyond his own ambition. He was going to build a life with Georgina, and that made everything matter more than it ever had before. They were married in El Paso on a bright Saturday in December of 1878 in a small church that was packed with ranchers and townspeople who had come to celebrate. Georgina wore a dress of cream-colored silk that her father had ordered specially from San Antonio, and Silas wore a new suit that felt strange but looked presentable. George walked his daughter down the aisle with tears in his eyes, and when he placed her hand in Silas's, he whispered, "Take care of my girl." "With my life," Silas promised, and he meant it absolutely. The reception was held at the Palmer Ranch, with food and music and dancing that lasted well into the night. Silas danced with his new wife under the stars, holding her close and marveling at how his life had changed in the space of a few months. He had gone from being a solitary man struggling to build a ranch to being a husband with a partner and a family, and a future that looked brighter than anything he had imagined. "What are you thinking?" Georgina asked, looking up at him as they swayed to the music. "That I am the luckiest man in Texas," Silas replied honestly. "That I nearly lost you before I ever met you, and now I get to spend the rest of my life loving you. It seems impossible and perfect at the same time." "Not impossible," Georgina said softly. "Just meant to be. Sometimes I think that stampede had to happen exactly the way it did. So you would be there to save me, so we would find each other. Does that sound foolish?" "Not at all," Silas said. "It sounds exactly right." They spent their first weeks of marriage at Silas's ranch, which they both agreed would be their primary home. It was smaller and more modest than the Palmer place, but it was theirs, and Georgina threw herself into making it a true home with the same energy she brought to everything else. She planted a vegetable garden, sewed curtains for the windows, and began making plans for additions to the small house. But they also spent considerable time at the Palmer Ranch, which George had made clear would someday belong to Georgina. He was training both of them in the full operation of his spread, sharing decades of knowledge and experience. Silas learned more about ranching in those months than he had in all his previous years combined, and he was grateful for every lesson. In the spring of 1879, the heifers George had sold to Silas began to drop their calves, and the sight of those strong, healthy babies was one of the most satisfying things Silas had ever experienced. His herd was growing, his ranch was improving, and he had a wife he loved more each day. Life was not perfect. There were still hard times, droughts and illnesses, and market fluctuations that tested them. But they faced everything together, and that made all the difference. In the summer of 1880, Georgina told Silas she was pregnant. The news filled him with joy and terror in equal measure. He worried about the dangers of childbirth in this harsh country, worried about whether he would be a good father, worried about 1,000 things that seemed overwhelming. But Georgina was calm and confident, and her certainty helped steady him. "We are going to be fine," she told him, taking his hands in hers. "You are going to be a wonderful father, and I am strong. Our baby is going to be healthy and loved, and that is what matters." She was right. In February of 1881, Georgina gave birth to a son they named Samuel George Anderson, after Silas's father and Georgina's. The baby was healthy and loud, with a surprisingly strong grip and his father's blue eyes. Silas held his son for the first time and felt something shift inside his chest, a fierce, protective love that was unlike anything he had ever experienced before. George was a doting grandfather, visiting constantly and spoiling his grandson shamelessly. He had begun to slow down a bit, allowing Silas and Georgina to take on more of the management of his ranch, and he seemed content to spend his time playing with Samuel and offering advice when asked. Over the next few years, the two ranches began to function almost as a single operation, with Silas and Georgina moving between them as needed. They hired additional hands for both places, and under their combined management, both operations thrived. Silas's small spread grew into a respectable ranch in its own right, while the Palmer Ranch continued to be one of the most successful in the area. In 1883, Georgina gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Grace Margaret after Georgina's mother. Grace had her mother's dark eyes and a sweet temperament that charmed everyone she met. Samuel, now 2 years old, was initially suspicious of this small intruder, but quickly became fiercely protective of his baby sister. Life settled into a rhythm that was busy but deeply satisfying. Silas worked the ranches with his men. Georgina managed the business side and the household, and together they raised their children in a home filled with love and laughter. They had their challenges, certainly. There were years when drought made grazing scarce, and they had to make hard decisions about their herds. There were times when cattle prices dropped and money was tight, and there was the ongoing struggle against the elements, predators, disease, and all the other dangers that came with ranching in West Texas. But through everything, Silas and Georgina faced life as a team. They made decisions together, supported each other through difficulties, and celebrated victories as shared triumphs. Their love deepened and matured, becoming something solid and enduring, the foundation upon which they built everything else. George Palmer passed away peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1886. He was 61 years old and had lived to see his daughter happily married, his grandchildren healthy and thriving, and the ranch he had built continuing to prosper under capable management. His death was sad, but not tragic. He had lived a good life and left behind a legacy of hard work, integrity, and love. Silas and Georgina officially merged the two ranches after George's death, creating a single large operation that stretched across nearly 10,000 acres and ran over 3,000 head of cattle. They kept the Palmer name for the main ranch house out of respect for George's memory, but everyone knew it was the Anderson Ranch now, built on the foundation George had laid, but grown and strengthened by Silas and Georgina's partnership. The children grew, as children do. Samuel developed his father's quiet competence and his mother's sharp mind for business. Grace inherited her father's calm demeanor and her mother's determination. In 1888, Georgina gave birth to their third child, another son they named Thomas, who proved to be the most adventurous of the three, always getting into mischief and keeping his parents on their toes. By 1890, Silas was 43 years old and Georgina was 34. They had been married for nearly 12 years, and the love between them had only grown stronger. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep, and they sat together on the porch of their home, Silas would think back to that August day in 1878 when he had heard the stampede and seen a woman in its path. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if I had not been there that day?" he asked Georgina one such evening. "If someone else had been tracking strays in that canyon, or if I had been just a few minutes later?" "I try not to," Georgina admitted, leaning against his shoulder. "It frightens me to think how close I came to dying before I ever really lived, before I met you, before we built all this, before our children." She took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "But you were there, Silas. You rode through that stampede to save me, and everything that came after is because you were brave enough to risk your life for a stranger." "Best decision I ever made," Silas said, kissing the top of her head. "Even if I did not know it at the time." "I knew," Georgina said softly. "From the moment you pulled me onto your horse and carried me to safety, some part of me knew that you were going to be important in my life. I just did not realize how important until later." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars and listening to the sounds of the night. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed softly. Closer by, a horse nickered in the corral. These were the sounds of their life, familiar and comforting and exactly right. "I love you, Georgina Anderson," Silas said. "More today than yesterday, less than tomorrow." "I love you too," Georgina replied. "My hero, my partner, my best friend. Thank you for saving me that day, and thank you for every day since." As the years continued to pass, the Anderson Ranch became one of the most respected operations in West Texas. Silas earned a reputation as a fair employer, an honest dealer, and a skilled rancher. Georgina was known for her sharp business sense and her involvement in the community, helping to establish a school in El Paso and working to improve conditions for ranch families throughout the area. Their children grew into capable young adults. Samuel showed every sign of being ready to take over the ranch someday, working alongside his father from a young age and absorbing everything Silas could teach him. Grace surprised everyone by developing a talent for horse training, and by the time she was 16, people were bringing difficult horses from all over the county for her to work with. Thomas, true to his adventurous nature, talked constantly about seeing the rest of the country, though his parents suspected he would eventually return to the ranch that was in his blood. In 1895, when Silas was 48 and Georgina was 39, they took a trip to San Antonio, leaving the ranch in Samuel's capable hands for a week. It was the first time they had been away from home for more than a day or two since their children had been born, and it felt both strange and wonderful to have time alone together. They stayed in a hotel that seemed luxurious after years of ranch living, with real wallpaper and gas lighting, and a dining room that served food they had not cooked themselves. They walked the streets of the growing city, visited shops and restaurants, and attended a theater performance that left them both amazed at the spectacle of it. But the best part was simply being together, rediscovering each other away from the constant demands of ranching children. They talked for hours about their lives, their hopes for the future, the dreams they still wanted to pursue, and they reaffirmed the love that had sustained them through nearly 17 years of marriage. "I would do it all again exactly the same way," Silas told Georgina on their last night in San Antonio. They were sitting on the balcony of their hotel room, looking out over the city lights. Every hard day, every challenge, every moment of doubt, it all led to this, to us, and I would not change a single thing. "Neither would I," Georgina agreed. "Well, perhaps I would have avoided that stampede if given the choice, but since it brought you into my life, even that seems necessary in retrospect." "Fate," Silas said with a smile. "Maybe we were always meant to find each other, and the stampede was just the universe's way of making sure we did." "Then I am grateful to the universe," Georgina said, even if its methods were a bit dramatic. They returned home to find that everything had run smoothly in their absence, confirming what they had suspected. Their children were growing up, becoming independent, preparing for lives of their own. It was bittersweet to realize, but also satisfying to know that they had raised capable, confident young people who would make their own marks on the world. In 1898, Samuel married a young woman named Catherine from a neighboring ranch, and the wedding was a joyous celebration that brought together families from across the county. Silas walked his daughter-in-law down the aisle alongside her father, and later danced with his own wife while remembering their own wedding 20 years earlier. "We are getting old," Silas said to Georgina as they danced. "Samuel is married, Grace will probably be next, and Thomas is talking about joining the cavalry." "We are not old," Georgina corrected. "We are experienced. There is a difference." "Fair enough," Silas conceded with a laugh. "But we are definitely not young anymore." "Good," Georgina said firmly. "I have no desire to be young again. I like being who we are now, with our history and our children and everything we have built together. Youth is overrated. Give me wisdom and experience any day." Silas pulled her closer, marveling as he always did at how perfectly she fit against him. "I love you, Georgina. Today, tomorrow, and always." "Always," Georgina echoed, and the word was a promise and a truth and everything that mattered. The new century arrived with both excitement and trepidation. The world was changing rapidly, with new technologies and new ideas transforming life in ways that seemed both thrilling and unsettling. But in West Texas, some things remained constant. The land still demanded hard work and respect. Cattle still needed to be tended and managed, and families still built their lives on foundations of love, faith, and determination. In 1902, Samuel and Catherine presented Silas and Georgina with their first grandchild, a boy they named George after his great-grandfather. Holding that tiny baby in his arms, Silas felt the circle of life complete itself in a way that was both humbling and profound. He was a grandfather now, part of a chain that stretched back into the past and forward into the future. "Your great-grandfather would be proud," Silas told the sleeping baby. "He built something that lasted, something that mattered, and we are going to make sure it keeps lasting for you and your children and all the generations to come." Georgina stood beside him, her arm around his waist, looking down at their grandson with tears of joy in her eyes. "He is perfect," she whispered. "Absolutely perfect." Grace married in 1904, choosing a rancher's son from near San Antonio who shared her love of horses. The wedding was held at the Anderson Ranch, and the celebration drew people from 3 counties. Silas gave his daughter away with pride and no small amount of sadness, though he knew she was making a good choice. Her husband, David, was a decent man who clearly adored Grace and respected her skills and independence. Thomas, true to his word, had joined the cavalry and was serving at Fort Bliss. He came home whenever he could, full of stories about his adventures and experiences. Silas worried about him, as any father would, but he was also proud of his son's courage and his desire to serve something larger than himself. By 1910, Silas was 63, and Georgina was 54. They had been married for 32 years, and the ranch they had built together was more successful than Silas had ever imagined possible when he was a young man struggling to survive on 50 head of cattle. They employed 20 men year-round, ran over 5,000 head, and owned land that seemed to stretch to the horizon. But more important than the material success was the family they had created. They had 3 healthy adult children, 2 sons-in-law and a daughter-in-law whom they loved as their own, and 4 grandchildren with another on the way. They had built not just a ranch but a legacy, something that would endure long after they were gone. On a warm evening in August of 1910, exactly 32 years after the day they had met, Silas and Georgina rode out to the canyon where the Stampede had happened. They had not been back there in years, and it took some time to find the exact spot. But eventually they stood together in the place where their story had begun, looking at the narrow gap between the boulders where Silas had pulled his horse to safety all those years ago. "I can still remember exactly how it felt," Silas said, his voice quiet in the evening stillness. "The terror, the certainty that I was probably about to die, but the equal certainty that I had to try anyway. I did not think about it. I just acted." "And saved my life," Georgina said. She slipped her hand into his, their fingers interlocking with the ease of long practice. "The best thing that ever happened to me was nearly dying in that canyon, because it brought you into my life. I like to think we would have found each other somehow," Silas said, "even without the Stampede." "Maybe," Georgina allowed. "But this was our way, and it is a good story. The kind of story our grandchildren will tell their grandchildren someday, about how their great-grandfather rode through a stampede to save their great-grandmother, and how that moment of courage and chance created everything that came after." They stood together as the sun set, painting the canyon walls in shades of gold and orange and red. The air was warm and still, filled with the scent of sage and dust and all the growing things that somehow managed to thrive in this harsh but beautiful land. This was their home, the place where their roots went deep into the earth, and neither of them could imagine being anywhere else. "Thank you, Silas said after a long silence. "For saying yes when I asked you to marry me, for building this life with me, for every day, every challenge, every moment of joy and sorrow. Thank you for being my partner in all of it." "Thank you for being brave enough to ride into that stampede," Georgina replied, "and for being brave enough to let me into your heart. You are the best man I have ever known, Silas Anderson, and I am grateful every day that you are mine." They kissed there in the canyon, husband and wife, partners and best friends, two people who had found each other against impossible odds and built something beautiful together. When they finally rode back to the ranch as full darkness fell, they rode side by side, as they had done for 32 years and would do for all the years remaining to them. The years that followed were good ones, marked by the steady rhythms of ranch life and the ongoing joy of watching their family grow. More grandchildren arrived, bright-eyed and full of energy, running through the ranch house and learning to ride almost before they could walk. Samuel took over more and more of the daily management of the ranch, allowing Silas to step back and take on an advisory role. Grace and her husband established their own successful horse breeding operation, and Thomas eventually returned from the cavalry and bought land adjacent to the family ranch, establishing his own spread with his parents' help and blessing. In 1918, Silas turned 71, and Georgina was 62. The world had been through a terrible war, and they had watched with fear and pride as some of their grandsons had gone off to fight. All had returned safely, thank God, though they came back changed by what they had seen and experienced. The country itself seemed different now, more modern and mechanized, with automobiles appearing on the roads and electricity beginning to reach even remote areas. But some things remained unchanged. The ranch still required hard work and dedication. The land still demanded respect. And Silas and Georgina still loved each other with a depth and constancy that had only grown over 4 decades of marriage. They celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary in December of 1918 with a large party at the ranch. All 3 of their children were there with their families, along with dozens of friends, neighbors, and ranch hands past and present. There was food and music and dancing, and at one point, Silas and Georgina danced together, while their family and friends formed a circle around them, clapping and cheering. 40 years, Georgina said, looking up at her husband with eyes that still held the warmth and love they had shown on their wedding day. "Can you believe it?" "Feels like both forever and no time at all," Silas replied. "The years have gone by so fast, but when I think about everything we have done and experienced together, it seems like a lifetime, a good lifetime, the best lifetime," Georgina agreed. "I would not change a single day of it." In their later years, Silas and Georgina spent more time simply enjoying each other's company and the fruits of their long labor. They took walks around the ranch, visiting favorite spots and remembering moments from their shared history. They sat on their porch in the evenings, watching the sun set and talking about everything and nothing. And they took delight in their grandchildren and, eventually, their great-grandchildren, marveling at how the family had grown from just the 2 of them into this large, thriving clan. Silas Anderson died peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1923, at the age of 76. He had lived a good, full life, and he left behind a legacy that would endure for generations. The ranch he had built with his wife continued to prosper under their children's management. His grandchildren and great-grandchildren carried his name and his values forward into a changing world. And the story of how he had ridden through a stampede to save the woman who would become his wife had become a cherished family legend, told and retold to teach lessons about courage, love, and the power of choosing to act when action was needed. Georgina lived for another 7 years, surrounded by the family she and Silas had created together. She remained active and engaged until the very end, still offering advice on ranch management and still taking joy in watching her descendants grow and thrive. But those who knew her best could see that part of her had left with Silas, that she was waiting patiently for the day when they would be reunited. She died quietly in her sleep in the autumn of 1930, at the age of 74. Her children buried her beside Silas on a small hill overlooking the ranch they had built together, under a sky that seemed to stretch forever. At the funeral, Samuel told the story of how his parents had met, about the stampede and the rescue, and the moment when 2 lives had intersected in a way that changed everything. "My father was the bravest man I ever knew," Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. "And my mother was the strongest woman. Together, they built something that will last long after all of us are gone. They built it on a foundation of love, hard work, and the kind of courage it takes to risk everything for someone you have just met. That is the legacy they left us, and it is a legacy worth honoring. The Anderson Ranch continued for generations after Silas and Georgina were gone, passing down through their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The land they had worked so hard to improve remained productive and beautiful. The cattle that descended from the heifers George Palmer had sold to Silas continued to thrive, and the family that had begun with a split-second decision in a canyon pass grew into a sprawling network of descendants who carried the Anderson name and values into a new century. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of Silas and Georgina Anderson was the story itself. The tale of the cowboy who heard the stampede, saw a woman in its path, and rode through the chaos to save her life. It was a story about courage and chance, about the moments that define us and the choices that change everything. It was a story about love found in the most unlikely circumstances and nurtured through decades of partnership and shared purpose. And it was a story that reminded everyone who heard it that the bravest thing we can do is act when action is needed, reach out when someone requires help, and open our hearts to the possibility that a single moment might contain the seeds of an entire lifetime of happiness. Silas Anderson had not known, when he turned his horse toward that stampede, that he was riding toward his future. He had only known that someone needed help, and he could not stand by and do nothing. That choice, made in an instant and without thought for his own safety, had created everything that followed: the marriage, the children, the ranch, the family, the legacy. All of it had begun with one man's decision to be brave when bravery was required, and one woman's gratitude that had transformed into love. It was a simple story in some ways, the kind of tale that could be told in a few sentences. But it was also an epic, a romance, an adventure, and a testament to the power of human connection. It was the story of how Silas Anderson heard the stampede and saw Georgina Palmer in its path, how he rode through the chaos to save her life, and how that rescue became the foundation of a love that lasted a lifetime and echoed through generations. In the end, it was not a story about cattle or ranches or the Wild West. It was a story about two people who found each other against impossible odds and chose to build something beautiful together. It was a story about love, courage, and the moments that matter most. And it was a story that proved that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is simply be there when someone needs us, because we never know when that moment might change not just their life, but our own in ways we cannot begin to imagine. The canyon where it all began still stood, weathered by time and wind, but fundamentally unchanged. The gap between the boulders where Silas had pulled his horse to safety remained, a silent witness to the moment that had created a family and a legacy. And if the descendants of Silas and Georgina Anderson ever went there, standing in that place where their story had begun, they could almost hear the thunder of hooves and see the desperate race against time that had saved a life and created a love that would endure forever.